Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to episode number 18 of The Apple and the Hero. My name is Sara Orfali, and today I would like to be your guide on the pathways of history. In the past month, we've traveled up and down Europe, looking for those heroes and heroines whose legends have founded our own modern countries. For the next few episodes, though, I would like to put down some roots, so to speak. We spent some time in Switzerland before, as it is the place where I live, so now I would like to introduce you to my home country, Italy. And what better topic could there be than the Romans? In September 2023, the entire world, and especially the female half of it, was told that Romans and their empire are never too far away from men's thoughts. I was honestly skeptic. With so many civilizations to choose from, was it really possible that so many people were dwelling on Romulus's descendants? And yet, in the time since that first article, my skepticism has been cured. There are in fact a lot of people, and not just men, thinking about the Romans and their empire. So I decided it was time to jump on the wagon myself. After all, you know what they say, right? When in Rome. For the next few episodes, I want to travel with you on the Roman cobblestones, meeting the heroes who have founded, shaped, and made immortal a small town in the middle of the Italian peninsula, oddly built on 7 hills. Many historians of the past have tried their hand at writing about the beginnings of the mighty Roman Empire. Livy, Plutarch, Fabius Pictor, Varro, Dionysius of Halicarnassus. They were all big names in antiquity, and now. Fabius Pictor gave us the first core of Romulus and Remus's legend. Livy, what is probably one of the most known versions of it. The stories I will tell you about today don't come from a specific author. If anything, they make use of all the versions out there to paint the most complete picture I can paint. I realized that if I had to give rightful paternity to each historian for every crumb of the story, things would get confusing very fast. So I decided I wasn't going to do that. I've read them all as a student, or at least part of each of their works, and I will use what they describe in order to build one single story. That said, let's go, fellow travelers. After all, you know what they say, right? All roads lead to Rome. Every story has a beginning, and the start of the Roman civilization is probably one of the most well-known. It has all the elements of a Homeric saga. Our hero Aeneas starts his journey from the burning Troy, carrying only his father, Anchises, his son, Ascanius, and a motley crew of survivors with him. After much peregrination, he finally lands in Lazio, where the gods have declared that a new Troy can be built. It's a world-famous story, right? No, I'm sorry, this is the wrong one. The word-famous story is the one involving a pair of half-divine twins, Romulus and Remus, the sons of Mars, being saved and fed by a she-wolf. Growing up together, in the end, Romulus kills Remus and founds Rome on his own. Sounds more familiar? If the answer is yes, don't worry, you're in good company. The story of Romulus and Remus is effectively the one everybody knows, while the tale of Aeneas is something which, while widely taught in schools in Italy, it hasn't really crossed the national borders. Foundations myths are the way contemporaries and posterity can judge a civilization. The virtues and the vices of the heroes and heroines of the stories are reflected on the citizens. While the story of Romulus and Remus does check a lot of good boxes, like godly ancestry, divine favor, filial piety, and strength of character, the end of that tale takes a very dark turn. It ends in blood, brother against brother, and Remus succumbs to Romulus' sword. While we might consider it suitably epic, having a fratricidal hero as the founding father wasn't exactly the look the Romans were going for. Don't get me wrong, the Romans thought there was a lot to be proud in this foundation's myth, otherwise they would have scrapped it long before it became so famous. But still, they have tried over the centuries to elevate it a bit, to rewrite or add to the narrative so it reflected their status of mightiest power of their time. At this point, I might as well make a confession. Of all the episodes of this deep dive in Roman history, I thought this was going to be the easiest to make. Like all children in Italy, I was taught the myth of Romulus and Remus in elementary school, and then the story of Aeneas and his voyages from Troy to Lazio in high school. These two narratives were so ingrained into me that I thought I had this in the bag. Just to refresh things a little, as an historian I wanted to be as precise as possible, I picked up a book. Upon the first 3 pages of this book, I was introduced to the character of Rome. She was a Trojan woman who, in some obscure versions of the founding myth of Rome, is credited with having founded the city. The story goes that she and other survivors from Troy had made landfall at the mouth of the Tiber. The men had wanted to rest for a bit and then continue on with the voyage, but the women had been tired of wandering around, so, unbeknownst to their men, they had burned their ships. To placate their angry husbands, the women, led by Rome, had used their womanly charms, and after kissing and cuddling and other things, they had been forgiven. In the end, the survivors had founded a city there, which then they called Rome, in honor of the woman who had come up with the plan. Apparently, in antiquity, this version was slightly more known than today, given that Plutarch cites this to explain why Roman matrons were so affectionate towards their husbands. They were, after all, still trying to make amends for the burned ships. So, this was a version I'd never heard before, but since the book went on to talk about Romulus and Remus, I still thought I had it all under control. And then I picked up another book. And this one suddenly started talking about Cacus and Hercules and Evander and just who were all these people? Realizing I needed a bit more information than that, I went digging. And what I found was an entirely new foundation myth. New for me, obviously. Apparently this story had been going around for millennia. Hercules was a known figure for me. Demigod, son of Zeus, tasked with completing 12 almost impossible labors. According to the story, it was after he had completed one of these labors, the 10th to be precise, that the Greek demigod found himself passing through Latium. He spent the night in the palace of Evander, a local king whose people had settled on the Palatine Hill, when he heard the story of Cacus the thief. In Roman mythology, Cacus was considered the son of Vulcan, the Roman equivalent of the Greek Hephaestus, and in some stories he'd taken residency on the Aventine Hill after his own father had kicked him out. From the cave he had elected as his abode, Cacus had taken to terrorizing the local people, Evander's people, stealing their cattle. Since Cacus was possibly a monster, descriptions vary, of divine origin and quite a mean streak, the people had been helpless in front of the thefts. So when Hercules had arrived at their doorsteps, Evander had seen the perfect opportunity to get rid of the problem once and for all. Hercules hadn't disappointed, and after having followed the desperate moves of the kidnapped cows, he had entered Cacus' cave and killed him. In his honor, Evander erected the Ara Maxima, one of the most ancient and famous places of worship in ancient Rome. So far, we've explored 2 of the lesser-known myths regarding the foundation of Rome. And while we've chanced upon steamy evenings and stolen cows, there's still no trace of a she-wolf. It's about time to dive into the 2 main stories related to the founding of the mightiest empire of its time. The myth of Romulus and Remus and the story of Aeneas of Troy. At this point, the question is, why two? Why does the Roman Empire have two different foundation myths, which are, at least in Italy, both equally famous? Well, the answer is because the myth of Romulus and Remus wasn't deemed to be up to standards when Augustus founded the Roman Empire and became its first emperor. The story of Romulus and Remus had always been seen as provincial, and the fratricide at the end was a little distasteful. While the Romans were proud of their mythical founder, regardless of his penchant for murder and kidnapping, as we will see in the next episode, and while the she-wolf was a beloved symbol on every corner of the city, Augustus realized that if he could link himself to heroes and gods, this would help cement his position as Rome's first emperor. Basically, if Rome and the Romans wanted to be a player in the world, they needed something better, something with a more direct godly pedigree. Enter Virgil and his new epic, heavily based on the Homeric classics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So based on it, that is basically the two of them squashed into one work. Why are we starting from Virgil's work, even though it was written way later than the first version of Romulus and Remus's myth? The answer is simple. While Virgil's goal was to write a new foundation myth for the newly founded Roman Empire, he was also aware that the more elements of the existing myths it could incorporate in it, the better it would be received. And so we have a protagonist coming from Troy, like Rome and her people. We will meet Evander over the course of the story, like in the myth of Cacus. And, most importantly, Aeneas himself is established as the ancestor of Romulus and Remus, thus connecting the mythical founder of Rome with the greatness of Troy. With this in mind, I have decided to start with Aeneas and then go on to the myth of Romulus and Remus, because, at least in Virgil's fictional timeline, Aeneas comes first. Before we delve into the story, let me add that had Virgil's friends and executors followed his last wishes, we would never have had this masterpiece. The author had left in his will that if the work wasn't complete by his death, it was to be burned. When Virgil died, he had been in the middle of a final revision, so technically his work wasn't finished. Deciding it was good enough, and that 58 incomplete verses weren't going to affect the legibility of the other 9,896, his friends presented the work to Augustus, who then ordered its publication as it was. To keep up with his Homeric aspiration, Virgil had titled this masterpiece in 12 volumes, Aeneid, from the name of the protagonist, Aeneas. The story starts in Troy. As the city burns, after the Greeks have managed to sneak in thanks to the horse, we meet the titular hero, Aeneas, trying to escape with his father Anchises, his son Ascanius, and his wife, Creusa. While the men manage to reach the ships and escape, Creusa is lost in the fire. Closely following the theme of the Odyssey, Virgil has Aeneas and his motley crew of survivors wander around the Mediterranean, searching for the promised land where they can rebuild the glory of Troy. Like Odysseus, Aeneas wanders for years, experiencing hardship, loss, but also love in the meantime. Pretty epic is his love story with the widow queen of Carthage, Dido. The presence of the Carthaginians here is not casual. Carthage had been one of Rome's great enemies, and it had taken them 3 wars, the Punic Wars, to finally get rid of it. As he was, in a way, rewriting the mythical history of Rome, Virgil seized the opportunity to explain the animosity between Rome and Carthage by having Aeneas jilt Dido on the altar after a whirlwind romance. To be fair to the poor guy, Aeneas would have loved to stay and marry Dido, but Jupiter, the Roman equivalent of Zeus, had come down from Olympus to remind him that his destiny wasn't in Africa. So there is that. In the end, Aeneas finally arrives at the Promised Land, which is conveniently located in Latium at the mouth of the Tiber. Who would have thought, right? Since the land is already inhabited by the Latins, governed by King Latinus, Aeneas sets out to build diplomatic relationships with them. Here Virgil takes a moment to explain, both to the Romans of his time and to us, that the Trojans are descended from Dardanus, a son of the nymph Electra and Jupiter, who had travelled from central Italy to Asia to found the city of Troy. So basically, the Latins and the Trojans are, at least in Virgil's mind, very distantly related. To create harmonious relationships between their two people, King Latinus decides to give his only daughter Lavinia in marriage to Aeneas. Lavinia, though, already had a sweetheart. His name is Turnus, king of the Rutuli, another of the native people of the area. But alas, reasons of state trump reasons of the heart, so the wedding between Aeneas and Lavinia is approved. Turnus is not particularly happy at the news, and it doesn't take a lot for Juno, Jupiter's scorned wife, who wasn't really fond of the Trojans, to push him into declaring war. Why was Juno so opposed to the Trojans, you ask? Well, do you remember the golden apple? The one that Paris was supposed to give to the most beautiful goddess between Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite. If you remember, he had chosen Aphrodite, the Roman Venus, scorning both Athena, the Roman Minerva, and Hera, the Roman Juno. According to the legends, Juno was quite capable of holding a grudge, and Aeneas was the son of Venus. So not only a Trojan had given the title of most beautiful to Venus, but also the leader of the Trojans was Venus's own son. Quite a difficult combination for Aeneas. While King Latinus is against such a course of action, loudly cursing Turnus for his hot-headedness, there's not much he can do to stop the war that's coming. Aeneas is in desperate need of allies at this point. His fellow Trojans are good, but not enough to stand against Turnus and the Rutuli. Following a suggestion by the Tiber river god Tiberinus, he goes inland to recruit Evander's people. If you think you've already heard the name, you're not wrong. He is the king of the people of the Palatine Hill, the one who had enlisted Hercules' help in getting rid of the thief Cacus. Why do we find Evander here? It's because not only Virgil was trying to come up with a new founding myth for Rome, but it was also trying to blend it with the existing stories so that it could take better roots. Now back to the story. While Aeneas is on his recruiting trip, the Trojans are overrun. It seems as if Turnus is going to win the war and get back Lavinia. Even the gods in Olympus are in disarray. Aeneas' defeat is not what the fates had prophesied. Still, rather than get in the middle of two quarreling goddesses, Juno and Venus, Jupiter opts for a non-intervention policy. When Aeneas comes back, he finds his camp in disarray and many of his friends dead. He feels it's about time to put a stop to this senseless war. He challenges Turnus to a duel and kills him. As promised, he takes Lavinia as his wife, and his son Ascanius, from then on known as Iulo, founds the city of Alba Longa on the Tiber. And it's exactly in the city of Alba Longa that the tale of Romulus and Remus starts. To be honest, it should be the tale of Remus and Romulus, as the Romans had always referred to the twins. Of the two, Remus is the eldest. Still, I'm going to keep Romulus on the front, as it's been the way I've learned it, and that's how everyone expects it. So, the most famous of Rome's foundation myths starts in Alba Longa. Please note that while we nowadays refer to these stories as myths, and we are somewhat clear that the people and the events didn't happen in real life, the Romans thought the other way around. For them, Aeneas and Romulus were as real as Caesar and Augustus, which means that the Romans knew exactly how much time had passed between the foundation of Alba Longa and the birth of Romulus and Remus as the latest heir to the Alban throne. If you're interested, it's about 400 years. So, 4 centuries after Iulo, son of Aeneas, had founded the city of Alba Longa, on its throne sits a man called Numitor. While it was Iulo, son of Aeneas and Creusa, who had founded the city, Numitor's line comes from the descendants of Aeneas and Lavinia. There's not much known about Numitor, except for the fact that he had a younger brother, Amulius, who one day decided to usurp the throne. While Amulius didn't kill his brother, we are told that he did murder Numitor's sons during a hunt in order to rid himself of all potential candidates for the throne. We are also told that Numitor had a daughter, Rea Silvia. Amulius decides not to kill his niece, but in order to ensure she won't be able to provide possible future heirs to the throne, he forces her to become a Vestal. The priestesses of Vesta, the goddess of the home for the Romans, were meant to remain pure for 30 years, as they attended the sacred fire which could never go out. So, by forcing Rea Silvia to become a Vestal, Amulius is basically ensuring she can't produce a descendants. Of course, the plans of the mortals mean nothing to a god. The story goes that one day, Mars, god of war, takes a fancy to Rea Silvia. At least in the version I learned in elementary school. As an adult, I then realized that it was way less pure than that. Mars forces himself on Rea Silvia, and the result is that she gets pregnant with twins. That she didn't consent to this is irrelevant for the law. Rea Silvia as a Vestal was supposed to remain chaste. Her pregnancy is a clear sign that she didn't abide by the law, so she is condemned to death. The standard punishment for a Vestal who wasn't pure anymore was being buried alive. So this is how the story ends for Rea Silvia. There are some other versions in which she survives, even though she's still not a part of her children's story. But the most mainstream one is, unfortunately, the one in which she dies. Since Amulius had forced his niece to become a Vestal, so she couldn't produce rightful heir, the news that he now has not one, but 2 nephews is very unwelcome. The children can threaten his position, so he decides it's better to get rid of them. The servants who are meant to drown them in the Tiber, though, get scared by the overflowing river, so they leave the basket with the children inside on the banks, thinking they would drown anyway. The god of the river, Tiberinus, though, doesn't let the children drown and guides the basket from Alba Longa to a relatively tranquil bend. Hungry, Romulus and Remus get out of the basket onto the muddy ground. Unfortunately, though, while the Tiber god has saved them, he cannot provide sustenance for the children. This is where Mars decides to finally fulfill a little of his parental duty. Rather than come down in person, he sends one of the animals sacred to him. And finally we meet her, the she-wolf of legend. Papped, even though her little ones are nowhere to be seen, the she-wolf offers her full udders to the children, who can finally eat their fill. Beloved by Mars as the wolf may be, the animal is still not enough to raise the children. The twins are then found by Faustulus, a local shepherd. He brings them home, where his wife, Acca Laurentia, has just given birth, but has unfortunately lost a child. There is another version of the legend, which states that, rather than a she-wolf, the twins get their first sustenance from a fig tree, whose milk-like sap is actually fit for human consumption. The legend calls this tree the Ficus ruminalis, from ruma, the Latin word for udder. In this version, the she-wolf, the lupa, as it's called in Latin and Italian, rather than a beast, is a woman. The other meaning for lupa in Latin was prostitute. In this version of the story, she is Acca Laurentia, Faustulus' wife, who is described as supplying her income on the side with other men. At some point, the two legends are conflated together, and we get the fig tree, the lupa as the animal, and poor Acca Laurentia back in her role of simple shepherd's wife. Under Faustulus and Acca Laurentia's care, Romulus and Remus grew up safe, knowing nothing of their true inheritance. As they grow, they start to show their different characters. Remus, the eldest, is the wilder one, the hot-headed one. Romulus, the youngest, is pious and great at strategy. One day, as Romulus is away at a sacrifice, Remus gets into a scuffle with Numitor's men and gets taken to Alba Longa as a prisoner. When Romulus comes home and finds his brother gone, he mounts a rescue, which ends up with the twins managing to defeat Amulius, giving back the throne to their grandfather Numitor. Now, the story in theory could finish like this. Numitor is back on the throne and he now has two rightful heirs to whom he can pass it when the time is right. But both Romulus and Remus don't want to wait around for the time when their grandfather will pass them the throne. They want their own city, and I want it now. After having received permission from the grandfather, Romulus and Remus now have to decide where to found this new city. The place is important. A wrong one would mean an unfortunate city. Romulus would like to found a new city on the Palatine Hill. As children, they were found there, so it seems auspicious enough. Remus, on the other hand, would prefer the Aventine Hill. How to choose, though? Since the city is to be put under Jupiter's protection, why not let Jupiter himself decide? At the same time, the father of the gods can indicate whether he would prefer Romulus as king or Remus. Leaving it all in the hands of the gods, Romulus and Remus go up the Aventine Hill, settle in, and wait for the omens to show them the way. At dawn, Remus is the first to shout. He's seen 6 birds coming from a good direction. It isn't the most auspicious, but it's still good enough. Thinking he's won, Remus goes over to where Romulus is to announce his victory. According to the legends, Romulus still hasn't seen anything by this point, so when his brother comes over, he plays for time. He's rewarded because as soon as Remus starts to tell him he's seen 6 birds, Romulus sees 12. What's more, they come from the most auspicious direction of all. For Romulus, it's clear enough that Jupiter has spoken and he is the winner of the contest. At this point, the legend splits. In one version, Remus doesn't accept the outcome, saying that it didn't matter how many birds Romulus had seen, Remus had seen them first. The twins come to blows and their followers start a war in which, sadly, Remus perishes at the hands of his brother. In another version, Remus initially accepts the divine verdict and yields, but later, when he sees Romulus digging the Pomerius, the sacred boundary of the city of Rome, he makes fun of the tiny walls that Romulus has started to build, saying that those little tiny things would never be enough to keep the enemy out. Romulus answers that he would kill anyone crossing those walls because they are the sacred protection of the city. Evidently not impressed, Remus makes a grand scene of stepping over the boundary, only for Romulus to plant a blade in his chest. There is also another version which states that Remus ruled alongside Romulus for some time before Romulus killed him for unspecified reasons. Whichever version you prefer, it doesn't matter. In the end, Remus always dies at the hands of Romulus, leaving his younger twin brother as the sole ruler of his brand new city. Had Remus been the chosen one, the city would have taken the name of Remuria. But as it's Romulus who's the founder, the city is called Roma. seized by guilt over his older brother's death, and very much afraid that Remus's spirit would come back to haunt him, with reason, I think, Romulus still creates a city called Lemuria, or Remuria, and puts his very much dead brother at its helm. It's the city of the dead, of the Lemures, those who have died unfulfilled and have to keep roaming the world of the living. And so it is that Rome was founded on the 21st of April of the year 753 BC, or so the Roman historians had gathered after some interesting mathematical acrobatics which had brought them to the number. In reality, Italian archaeologists have found traces of a wall exactly where the Pomerium should have been, dating from around this time. It's not proof, but it's funny to think that a date which had always been taken for legendary might actually be true. Through underhanded methods and fratricide, Romulus is now the sole ruler of his new city. The troubles for him, though, are just getting started. And so, my fellow travellers, we have arrived at the end of this first section of our long path through the history of the Roman Empire. Rome has been founded. The first seeds of a later greatness has been sown. I invite you here in 2 weeks to see how Romulus planned to fill his empty city with people and how this new, rising power ended up affecting the political balance of the native population. In the meantime, stay tuned and discover other juicy bits of history on my Instagram channel at The Apple and the Hero, or subscribe to my newsletter. As always, all the research and the writing for this episode has been done by me, Sara Orfali, Doctor in History. Goodbye for now. Safe travels.